Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. And now we come to class number 5 in our introductory series called The Path to Inner Freedom. And so in today's class, we come to the path itself. So what we've been discussing so far has been, we could say, preparatory for the path. And this path is what the Buddha called the Noble Eightfold Path. And the path comes as the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. So I presented the Four Noble Truths in a general way in the second class. So we have the Noble Truth of dukkha, or suffering, the Noble Truth of the origin of suffering, the Noble Truth of the cessation of suffering, and then the fourth truth is called the Noble Truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And so you can see how the four truths fit together into a very coherent and meaningful pattern. So we start off with the problem, the diagnosis of the problem, seeking its cause, its origins, then the announcement that a solution is possible, and then the fourth truth is the prescription of the solution itself, the remedy, we say the medicine to cure the illness. And maybe we could say that the fourth noble truth is the distinctive discovery of the Buddha. Like before his enlightenment, the Buddha was aware of the problem of suffering. That's why he left his life in the palace as an aristocrat and gave it all up and went into the forest, adopting the life of a spiritual seeker. And he had some, say, general sense of the cause of the problem, and the reason why he would have left the household life, because he believed that a solution was possible. So what he had to discover was the method that would bring about the solution. And so the discovery that made him distinctly a Buddha was the discovery of the path, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Buddha calls this, in his first discourse, he calls the Noble Eightfold Path the middle way, because it avoids the two extremes, what he calls the two extremes, for those who have left the household life. So one of these would have been indulgence in sensual pleasures. And then the other extreme, which was common during the India of his time, and it's also, I think, probably still practiced by Indian ascetics or swamis today, and that is the path of extreme asceticism, extreme austerities. And so the Buddha calls this the middle way because it avoids those two extremes. And I have to add a statement of caution about the Noble Eightfold Path. Sometimes we're inclined to take the Noble Eightfold Path to be the normal model of Buddhist practice. But that is not actually the case. You know, it's not the case that every Buddhist is practicing the Noble Eightfold Path in its fullness. But the Noble Eightfold Path, we could say, is the pinnacle or the high point of Buddhist practice. And so the general practices of Buddhism recommended for the general population don't include the higher stages of the Noble Eightfold Path. Like those are generally, you see, the Buddha calls the Noble Eightfold Path, it's the way to liberation, the way to enlightenment, the way to higher knowledge and to ultimate freedom. And so for the general population, the Buddha prescribes various other practices that we could say prepare the way for entering upon the Noble Eightfold Path. And next week I'll cover some of those more basic practices. But now we want to look into this higher model of Buddha's practice, the Noble Eightfold Path. And when we use the expression Eightfold Path, one might get the impression that this is a sequential path going from factor number 1 to factor number 8, that it's a path that one goes through in stages. That would be, I would say, an imperfect understanding of the path. What I would say is that the factors of the path arise in a certain sequence, like the later stages tend to build upon the earlier stages. But this doesn't mean that when one gets to stage 3, one leaves behind step 1 and 2, and that when you get to step 7, that you leave behind steps 1 to 6. But rather, we could say that each factor that arises absorbs and builds upon the earlier factors. And so when we come to the ideal model of the practice of the Eightfold Path, we have 8 factors working together in unison. I compare this maybe to, maybe we could use I don't know if there are any 8-lane highways. And in any case, if there were an 8, what is that? Tappan Zee Bridge has 8 lanes. But anyway, even if there's an 8-lane highway, in the car you would only be driving in 1 lane at a time. You can't be bringing 8 lanes together in 1 car. So maybe the model or the analogy that I've thought of is better. It's a cable made up of 8, call this fibers, woven together. And so when you have the cable with 8 fibers woven together, all of those fibers that make up the cable are working together to help to lift up the weight. You know, we have this cable with a pulley, and so as you're winding the pulley up, so it's lifting up the heavy weight. So the 8 fibers are there in the cable, and each one is giving its strength to the other 7 fibers, so that the cable has this greater tensile strength. Okay, so the path begins with right view, which means right understanding. And the Buddha said that right view, he calls it the forerunner of the Noble Eightfold Path. And I would compare it to like the eye of the path, whereas the other 7 factors we might call the legs of the path. If we could change the number of legs, we might compare this to a spider has 8 legs. Okay, but it has eyes. So suppose we have a spider with 7 legs. It has a pair of eyes, and then it uses its eyes to see where it's moving, and the 7 legs to move in the direction in which to the place that it wants to reach. Okay, so the Buddha calls right view the forerunner or the eye of the path, and right view is stated in the formula, is stated to be the understanding of the 4 Noble Truths themselves. And in fact, we could say all of the other principles of the Buddha's teaching that we touched on in the previous few classes all come within the scope of right view. So we could say that right view at one level means the understanding of the law of karma and its results, understanding how our intentional actions create karma that has the potential to ripen and bring results to ourselves as we move from life to life. So it's an understanding that we are responsible for our own actions and that our morally significant actions have consequences. consequences that will eventually bounce back upon ourselves. Okay, so that is one level of right view. And sometimes that is called the mundane right view. The right view that is sort of understands the principles that work within the scope of worldly existence. The other right view, or the other aspect of right view, is what I call liberative right view. The right view that leads to liberation. You see, the right view of karma and its results, that will guide us in making our moral choices, to choose wholesome conduct over unwholesome conduct. But the right view of karma and its results on its own doesn't have the capacity to lead to liberation. It merely determines what kind of choices we make so that we experience good results, desirable results, as we move from life to life. But the view that leads to liberation, to realizing the ultimate good, enlightenment and liberation, that is the right view of such principles as the three characteristics that I spoke about last week: impermanence, suffering, non-self, the understanding of the law of conditioned arising, and especially the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And so with the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, we get a perspective on the place where we're starting out from, that is, understanding dukkha or suffering, gaining some insight into the underlying causation of suffering, which the Buddha says is basically craving and ignorance, or sometimes greed, hatred, and delusion. Understanding that cessation of suffering is possible, and knowing the way to liberation from suffering. Maybe I would compare this to, like, if you want to set out on the path, to follow the path, you have to be guided by right view, a sort of right view that makes all of the other factors parts of the noble path. And I compare this, the way the function of right view here, it's like if you want to travel, say, by car from Carmel, New York, or Cold Spring, New York, wherever, to Washington, D.C. Then first you have to know what is your starting point. It's like maybe when you're putting in directions, well, now everything is a little too convenient with these electronic devices. But suppose we're in a pre-electronic age and you have to consult the map, so you look on the map where you are now. So that is seeing the first noble truth. You want to see your destination, that's like seeing the third noble truth. And then you have to, using the map, trace the roads that you'll take, what turnoffs you'll make, where are the shortcuts, what are the highways, expressways, until you get to Washington, D.C. And nowadays you put in the starting point, boom, boom, boom. Then you put in the destination, tap, 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 tap. Then you press a button and then a map will appear with a red line, blue line, whatever, showing the roads, all of the turns, and then with a set of directions, and not only that, but you turn on the voice, and then as you're driving, the voice will tell you, turn right here, turn left there. Okay, but following the Noble Eightfold Path, we don't always have the advantage of that voice telling us where to turn left, where to turn right. So we have to experiment, learn how to put the path into practice through personal experimentation. Okay, so from right view, having this right understanding, then one moves into the second factor of the path, This is called, in Pali, Sammā-sankappa, Sammā-sankappa, which could be translated right intention or right purpose. And so when one has the right view, the right understanding, that view or understanding, as we sort of cultivate and nurture that understanding, it starts to have a transformative effect on our own intentions, the kinds of purposes we set for ourselves, the kind of motivations that govern our behavior, our conduct. So on the basis of right view, it gives rise to these right intentions. So we have here the intention of renunciation or detachment. And this doesn't mean, when you say the intention of renunciation, that if you're following the Noble Eightfold Path, you have to give up or renounce the household life to become a monk or nun. But rather what this means is that as the understanding of the Four Noble Truths develop in the mind, it leads to a kind of recognition that it's our craving and our greed that generates suffering. And so the impact of that is that this understanding of suffering brings a kind of growing detachment from the compelling voice of greed, telling us, you need that to be happy, you need that to be happy. So instead, the intention starts to shift as one discovers that one could be happy, more peaceful, more joyful, with less dependence on material things. And so that constant cloying of greed begins to weaken and gradually wither up, and one develops a kind of natural detachment from that compelling voice of greed or craving. And then the understanding of the truth of suffering, particularly with regard to other people, the way I see it, understanding of suffering in regard to oneself is what leads to the intention of renunciation or detachment, since one sees that greed and craving lead to suffering for oneself. But one becomes more and more sensitive, more and more aware of the sufferings of others, and so this will bring about transformations in one's attitude towards other people and even other living beings. And so instead of nurturing sometimes an intention of, or motivations of aversion, dislike for others, ill will, wishing for the harm of others, this will give rise, or one's understanding will give rise to the intention of goodwill, wishing for the well-being and happiness of others. And this is what we also call loving kindness, the wish for others to be well and happy. And that will become a more and more prominent, more and more decisive motivation for one's behavior. So instead of acting sometimes in spiteful ways towards others, or in aggressive ways, or even in apathetic or indifferent ways towards others, one will become full of goodwill, benevolence, loving kindness towards others, wishing for their well-being and happiness. And then the counterpart of goodwill is the intention of harmlessness. That is, instead of the wish to inflict harm and suffering on others, or the urge, let's say the impulses of cruelty, there will arise the intention of non-harming. In Pali, this is called avihingsa, which is very similar to the word ahimsa, which you might have heard of as a basic virtue advocated by Gandhi in India. But actually Gandhi borrowed that from Buddhism. Yeah, so this is you could say that the intention of harmlessness is what expresses or comes to which blossoms in the spirit of compassion, wishing to remove the suffering of others. And so loving kindness is the wish for others to be well and happy. Compassion, the wish for others to be free from suffering. Okay, so these two factors together, I would say, are the sort of guides to the rest of the path. So these are the maybe two legs on which the rest of the path rests as its foundation. Okay, then come the next three factors belong together, and these three constitute the basic ethical code, or you could say the ethical section of the Noble Eightfold Path. So we have two fundamental doors or channels through which we act in the world, through which our actions manifest in the world. One is speech, and the other is bodily action. And so under right speech, the Buddha enumerated 4 factors. Okay, so this is right speech is expressed as abstaining from false speech and instead speaking the truth. Abstaining from slanderous speech or speech which creates divisions and conflict between others, and instead speaking in ways that promote harmony and unity between people. Abstaining from harsh speech and instead speaking gently, in pleasing ways, in ways that will win the affection of others, and then abstaining from gossip or idle chatter, and instead speaking in ways that are meaningful and that are rich in meaning and that will be beneficial to others. So that is the side of speech. Then we come to the side of action, bodily action. So here the Buddha enumerates 3 factors that constitute right bodily action. So abstaining from taking life, from stealing, and from sexual misconduct. Okay, but the Buddha widened, so we have here these 2 aspects of speech and bodily action incorporated in the path, but the Buddha widened the ethical scope of the path by including right livelihood within the Noble Eightfold Path, because he saw that it's necessary for people to live, to earn a living, and even though one might earn a living in a way that doesn't directly involve any of the kinds of wrong speech or wrong action, but one could still earn a living in a way that inflicts harm and suffering on others. And so the Buddha said in a general way, he says that one gives up wrong livelihood and earns one's living by a right livelihood. And so this is a very general statement, but in a sutta, discourse in one of the books of the canon, the Buddha mentions 5 types of livelihood that in his time and area would have been considered wrong livelihood. Let me see if I can remember these offhand. Okay, so 1 is dealing in living beings, and that will include dealing in human beings, for example, being involved in the slave trade, and also dealing with animals for slaughter, raising animals for slaughter. So even if one is not killing the animals oneself, but if one is raising them with the intention of selling them to be slaughtered, that would be considered a wrong livelihood. Okay, another type of area of wrong livelihood is, which really has very contemporary relevance, is dealing in weapons. So selling weapons that will be used, that could be used to kill people. The third is dealing in poisons. Of course, there are many chemicals today that can be used as poisons, and so if somebody is selling these chemicals and somebody uses it to poison themselves, they're not guilty of wrong livelihood. But this would be a trade which specifically sells items to be used to poison others. Okay, and then a fourth is dealing in intoxicating substances. Even selling liquor, and today we would say dealing in drugs that are part of the drug trade. And then the fifth is earning one's living by meat, dealing in meat, selling meat. And today I know that there are, I think probably in ancient India during the Buddha's time, the distinctions of different modes of livelihood was probably pretty clear and sharp. Today, in this very interdependent world where businesses, sometimes a single corporation or company, will have many different subsidiaries, the lines have become much more ambiguous. And so one has to use a certain degree of discernment and a sense of conscientiousness in order to determine whether one is oneself involved in a wrong livelihood. Okay, next we come to three factors which work together as constituting what we would call the meditative side of the path. Okay, so factor number 6 is right effort. And this is the effort in training the mind in order to eliminate the unwholesome states and to cultivate the wholesome states. And the Buddha, first he distinguishes, he divides the mind, or the factors or qualities of the mind, into two broad categories. So we call one side is the unwholesome side. So those are the sides, the qualities of mind, the motivations that eventually bring suffering to oneself and suffering to others. And we use the term to designate them as defilements. So they are the defilements of the mind. And then the other side of the mind are the wholesome qualities, the healthy or skillful qualities of mind, the qualities that when cultivated will be beneficial to oneself and beneficial to others. So like the unwholesome qualities would be things like selfishness, greed, miserliness, anger, hatred, resentment, jealousy, envy, laziness, agitation, conceit, arrogance, a whole bunch of unwholesome mental factors. And then the wholesome qualities will be states like generosity, kindness, compassion, mindfulness, energy, clear comprehension, wisdom. Okay, so we have first the unwholesome side and the wholesome side. And then with respect to each side, there are two functions that have to be exercised. First, with regard to the unwholesome qualities or the defilements, there is the effort to restrain the defilements, to prevent them from arising. So those defilements, those unwholesome qualities, lie deep within the mind as sort of habitual tendencies, which we have indulged in again and again. And so any individual has a whole mass of unwholesome potentials that are always seeking the opportunity to rise into the mind and then to gather strength through indulgence and repetition. And so what one has to do with right effort is to keep a watch on the mind, and when one sees the unwholesome tendencies starting to arise, then one has to make the effort to restrain the mind, to prevent oneself from yielding to those tendencies, and to keep the mind in check. It's a way of mental cultivation which requires a pretty high degree of vigilance. And like that is one of the things that one does in meditation, one of the skills that develops in meditation. Because until we start practicing meditation, those unwholesome tendencies can rise up in very subtle ways, and we don't even recognize them. We're just not paying attention, and before we know it, we're indulging in thoughts of resentment, anger, we're nurturing fantasies that are rooted in greed and craving, and then we're completely helpless in the grip of those active forces of the mind. So with the practice of attention to the mind, observing the mind, then we're able to see those unwholesome qualities as they start to bubble into the mind in the form of subtle thoughts. And then we could apply the effort to restrain the mind, to prevent the mind from latching on to those thoughts and following up on them. Okay, so that is the effort to restrain the defilements. The second is the effort to abandon those defilements. So when the defilements, the unwholesome qualities arise in the mind, then to cultivate the mind, one has to use the appropriate method for overcoming those defilements, for weakening them and then removing them. And when one reads the Buddha's discourses, one sees in many different suttas, the Buddha prescribes whole varieties of methods for dealing with many different varieties of unwholesome mental tendencies. It's a little bit like, sometimes we use the analogy of a pharmacist who has many different medicines for different illnesses. And so when a person comes with a particular illness to the pharmacist and says, I have this condition, then the pharmacist will prescribe the appropriate medicine for the particular condition. And so this is the effort to abandon those defilements that have already arisen. Okay, then in the mind, sort of along with the unwholesome tendencies, we all have many, many undeveloped potentials. In fact, like we could say that everybody has the potential to achieve enlightenment. But in order to achieve enlightenment, one has to know the qualities that are to be developed, and one has to know how to develop those qualities. And then once one knows how to develop them, then one has to make the effort to develop those wholesome qualities. So for example, one set of wholesome qualities would be what are called the 5 spiritual faculties. So these would be faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. So these 5 wholesome mental qualities have, when they're developed together, have the potential to lead all the ways to enlightenment. But they're too often, they're impeded by faith is impeded by doubt, energy is impeded by dullness or laziness, mindfulness is impeded by negligence, concentration is impeded by distraction, and wisdom is impeded by foolishness or just negligence. And so, to cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path, one makes the effort to bring into being these 5 beautiful spiritual faculties. And then one brings them into being using the appropriate methods for arousing each of these factors. All of them are lying dormant in the mind, but using the appropriate method, we activate them, we bring them up, we sort of wake them up from their sleeping condition. And when those 5 wake up and play dominant roles in the mind, then they can knock away all of the barriers that we face and bring us all the ways to the ultimate goal. But too often, even those of us who have been monks a long time, we face those 5 hindrances that prevent the flowering of the 5 spiritual faculties. Okay, so once one develops those wholesome states, then the 4th effort is to stabilize them, to maintain them, to keep them active, and then to develop them further and further until they come to fulfillment. Okay, so this is right effort. Then we come to what I would call the core of Buddhist meditation practice. And that is summed up in this expression called right mindfulness. And now mindfulness has become almost like a buzzword that's propagating through the popular culture today. So you want to develop any kind of skill. In the business world, all of the business executives are training their workforce in courses in mindfulness so they'll become more effective workers. Students are learning mindfulness in the schools so they become better students. Cooks are learning mindfulness so you do mindful cooking and you can become a more skillful cook. What are some of the other things? Mindful, I've seen the mindful gardener, mindful romance, mindful parenting. I mean, all of that is, mindfulness is useful in all of those roles. But in the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha speaks about right mindfulness as being part of this path to deepening wisdom and to the eventual attainment of enlightenment. And so the Buddha speaks about mindfulness in terms of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 bases of mindfulness. And so the purpose of mindfulness here is to deepen one's awareness of the various aspects of one's own being, one's own existence, bodily and mental existence, in order to pave the way for the arising of insight or wisdom. And so the Buddha sort of schematized the objects of mindfulness in terms of 4, what he calls these 4 foundations of mindfulness. So we have mindful contemplation of the body, of feelings, states of mind, and then he uses a broad term. In Pali it's the word Dhamma, which here I just translate as phenomena. But then I included some of the highlights from the Buddha's most famous discourse on mindfulness, the discourse on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Okay, so here we could see some of the key meditation practices. So the Buddha starts with the body because the body being physical matter, it's the easiest to observe, even though it's often difficult to keep the mind focused on the body, but still the body is something which is more readily available to us. It's relatively coarse compared to the mental factors. And so within the contemplation of the body, the subject that's usually considered the starting point, the foundation, the basis for all the other types of Buddhist meditation is the mindfulness of breathing, which we've been learning here over the past few weeks. So the breath is sort of the anchor point for the whole unfolding of the four foundations of mindfulness. But then, as an alternative to the mindfulness of breathing, we have the second exercise, which is called mindfulness of the postures. And so the body is held in different positions: sitting, standing, walking. I should go from standing, walking, sitting, and lying down. And so when we're doing sitting meditation, like on a meditation retreat, we can't be sitting all the time. So the regular practice in most meditation systems is to alternate periods of sitting meditation with the walking meditation. I think Bhante Mangala explained this on the first session that we had here. So to do the walking meditation, one usually chooses a walkway. It could be like about 20, 30 meters. And one just walks mindfully, being mindful of each step. When taking the right step, one is mindful of the right step. When taking the left step, one is mindful of the left step. And so one is being mindful of right, left, left. But it's very different from soldiers marching in a military parade. They're just going right, left. But here, when doing the walking meditation, the objective is to be attentive to each aspect of each step, to keep the mindfulness anchored on the body in the whole process of the step. So in taking the right step, one is aware of the whole right step. When taking the left step, aware of the whole left step. And so on, till one comes to the end of the walkway. Then mindfully, one turns around, mindfully pauses, then mindfully walks back to the other side of the walkway. And so one can be walking for a half an hour, even an hour, just attentive to the body as one is taking step after step. And in this way, one builds up a very, very powerful mindfulness that one could bring into one's regular activities. So the Buddhist texts say that when you practice mindfulness of walking, the walking meditation, then when you engage in other activities of your day-to-day life, that mindfulness will stay with you. If you're just doing the mindfulness of breathing in the sitting posture, it's wonderful while you're sitting, but then when you get up, too often people think, okay, finish with the meditation, put the object down, and now I just hurry and scurry, and my mind starts buzzing with all sorts of thoughts, all sorts of impulses, no control. But when you practice also periods of the walking meditation, then there's a kind of smooth transition. So when you stop the mindful walking, then whatever else you're doing, the mindfulness trails along, it's right there. And so in this way, through the mindfulness of the postures, particularly the walking, then when one engages in the regular daily activities, one acts with mindfulness and clear comprehension. Okay, there are some other aspects of the mindful contemplation of the body, but I want to cover all of the bases of mindfulness, so I'll pass over them for now. But I think what's important in terms of the regular practice is to know the mindfulness of breathing, and I suggest also including a short period, even 10 minutes of walking meditation. So if you're doing 20 minutes of sitting meditation, mindful of the breath, then when you finish, before just going into your regular activities, find a little space where you can walk 20 steps, either in your house or if it's not too cold outside, preferably in a backyard so people don't see you walking back and forth slowly and mindfully. They'll think this person is a little bit kooky, walking back and forth like that. Did they lose a key or something? Okay, so add a short period of walking meditation. You'll see that it brings along that kind of mindfulness and action that one could carry into one's daily activities. Okay, then the second area of mindfulness, which we introduced last week, is mindful contemplation of feelings. And by feelings here is not meant emotions, which is a rather complex phenomena, but the feelings of pleasant feelings, painful feelings. And the Buddha also mentions what comes in between, the very subtle feeling that we call neutral feelings. So this sort of enters into the meditative process when one is doing, particularly as extending the period of sitting meditation, then one starts to feel pain in the body. So it could be pain in the legs, in the buttocks, in the back. And so the initial impulse, you're sitting there, maybe starting to get good concentration on the breath. Okay, my concentration is going well. Oops! Pain in the legs. Why is it bothering me? Why is it disturbing my meditation? Then I have to get back to my good concentration on the breath, so I start changing the posture immediately. Have to get rid of that pain. Okay, but the way one trains oneself, when pain arises, one doesn't immediately change. But instead, one could try ignoring the pain for some time, but when the pain gets more prominent, one could just observe the pain. Just watch the pain, turn it into an object of observation. And then it becomes part of the meditative process, not an obstacle, but a way to expand the scope of one's mindfulness. And then at times, the meditation might be going well, and so then pleasant feelings start to arise, even if the mind gets really concentrated. And then you start feeling a joy and bliss. Wow, this is wonderful. I never experienced this before. So then this pleasant feeling arises. One latches on to that. And then one starts thinking, I have to recapture it. I have to recapture it. Then it's gone. Okay, so when this happens, when the pleasant feeling arises, one just recognizes pleasant feeling and lets it go. And so, or one could go on observing the pleasant feeling, just watching pleasant feeling and just turning it into an object of meditation and see how the pleasant feeling becomes a basis for attachment. The painful feeling can become a trigger for ill will or aversion. And then the neutral feeling is very subtle, but when the mind becomes trained through pleasant feeling and painful feeling, then one could start tuning in on the neutral feeling. So one turns the feeling into an object of contemplation. Then the third area of mindfulness is the contemplation of the state of mind. And so the way this is laid out sort of simply in the text, one observes the state of mind in order to determine whether the mind is associated with greed or associated with hatred or aversion, associated with delusion, or in contrast with that, disconnected from greed, from hatred, from delusion. And perhaps the natural connection here is that from the feelings, well, we should say that the three kinds of feelings act as the stimuli or triggers for the three unwholesome states of mind. So there's a kind of correlation between pleasant feelings and greed. Because when one experiences pleasant feeling, whether in meditation or in day-to-day life, then there comes the attachment to that pleasant feeling and to the object that stimulates the pleasant feeling. But feelings and their objects are bound to change. And so if you're clinging to the pleasant feeling and to the object that stimulates the pleasant feeling, when the feeling changes, when the object changes, then there will arise dejection, unhappiness, resentment. And so then aversion arises, or hatred, because the pleasant feeling, or the object of pleasant feeling, has vanished. And then when painful feeling arises, whether in the body, through sitting in meditation, or through things that take place in one's everyday life, the natural response is aversion to the painful feeling or to the situation that causes the painful feeling. But instead, one turns that state of mind into an object. So when aversion arises, instead of surrendering to it, one just observes the mind in the grip of aversion. And then when one is confused and deluded about something, that is delusion. That is very subtle, but usually the way one begins, sort of the clearer objects of observation are greed and aversion, or the state of mind, the mind connected with greed, connected with hatred. And what one finds is that when one focuses in on these states of mind, that they lose their power. The unwholesome states lose their power over the mind. So when we're not clearly aware of them, they are the king and the queen. They're the ones in charge. And we're just their servants. But when we turn the beam of awareness around and say, greed has arisen, craving has arisen for things that are pleasant. And when one recognizes them, then that greed sort of starts shrinking and shrinking and fading away, until it's gone. And then similarly, when hatred or anger or aversion arise, the mind is bubbling over with anger. I don't like this, I don't like that, I want to get rid of this, I don't like that one, I don't like that guy, this girl, I don't like. But you turn the mind around and you focus in on those thoughts of ill will and hatred, and then they start losing their power, becoming weaker and more meeker and saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to try to take over your mind, forgive me, let me go out. And then they start heading for the exit. Okay, so this is mindful contemplation of the mind, getting to know your own mind in finer and finer detail. Okay, then comes what we call mindful contemplation of phenomena. This gets a bit technical, because here the sutta, or the discourse, groups together various sets of phenomena that play key roles in the Buddha's teaching. So I won't go into detail with this, but what this involves is basically tuning in to the basic objects of insight, like the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense faculties, in order to gain insight into the impermanent, unsatisfactory, and non-self nature of phenomena. Okay, so that is the practice of right mindfulness, Okay, now as right effort and right mindfulness work together, they can lead into the eighth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is called right concentration. And these are 4 stages of very deep, one-pointed unification of the mind, states in which the mind becomes completely absorbed in its object without any arising of discursive thinking. So these are states of samadhi, one-pointed absorption in the object. And I'm not going to go into the distinctions of these 4 stages here, but what's important to know about the Buddha's path is that right concentration is not an end in itself, but when right concentration occurs, it has all the other 7 path factors unified with it. And so one then uses this concentrated mind to start examining and investigating the nature of the body and mind in terms of the impermanence of all phenomena. And that is what brings the arising of insight, the insight that will lead to liberation. Okay, so maybe this will do as a kind of broad overview of the Noble Eightfold Path. I think at a later time I'm going to give like a capsule program on the Noble Eightfold Path so we can take it in more detail. But for now we just have to stop with this broad overview and maybe have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So please, again, don't feel shy about asking questions, even if you think they're simple or silly, but please feel welcome to ask.
Hi, my name's John. Okay, taking life.
Yeah.
I'm taking life right now because inside of me I took antibiotics and I'm taking life now.
Yeah.
I step on bugs and that kind of thing. I'm taking life.
Yeah.
Is that...
Okay, that's a good... Is that...
Yeah, is that the... I mean, is it that finite
No.
description?
Okay, it's a good question.
Okay.
You know, what is meant by the violation of all of these ethical principles is intentional or volitional violation. And so you mentioned the example that you're walking and then you're stepping on insects. You're not doing it intentionally. So you're not doing it intentionally. So it's not breaking the precept or creating the unwholesome karma of taking life. And as far as taking medicines, my own opinion that the kinds of life forms like the viruses or microbes would not count as the kind of sentient beings that are covered by the precept. Otherwise we couldn't live in this world if we didn't take the medicines that we need to eliminate diseases. Okay, Merit, was that your hand?
Yeah, me again. Is this your work?
That's mine, yeah.
Ah, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. On page 7, I was reading, and it said, our lives, for the most part, are strung out between the thirst for pleasure and the fear of pain.
Yeah.
We pass our days running after the one and running away from the other.
Yeah.
Seldom enjoying the peace of contentment.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say, real satisfaction seems somehow always out of reach,
Yeah.
just beyond the next horizon. Then in the end, we have to die.
Then what?
Then in the end, we have to die.
Yeah.
To give up the identity we spent our whole life building, to leave behind everything and everyone we love. That really struck me. So, okay, so, all right, so I need some help, with all that internal stuff that's going on there.
Yeah.
And on page 8, it says, the work of removing the defilements has to proceed in a methodical way, which you touched upon. it cannot be accomplished simply by an act of will,
Yeah.
by wanting them to go away.
Yeah.
The work must be guided by investigation. By investigation.
Yeah,
Those are your words. It says the work
Yeah, I know, but I don't remember.
must be guided by investigation.
Yeah, okay.
Which is, I can't do this alone. That's
Yeah.
one of the things I realize, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm so grateful for the instruction that you're giving here
Yeah.
today. So, we have our class next week, and then it ends,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
As the Chinese say, there's no banquet without ending, right?
yeah, yeah,
Right. So, if I want to proceed along the path,
yeah,
right, but I know I can't do this on my own,
yeah, yeah.
what's the best way for me to get instruction,
Yeah.
have, guidance on that path?
Yeah.
Keep coming, you said? Oh, I like that.
Yeah, I would
Say keep coming.
I would say, I was thinking, can I do something in the fall? But I see that our schedule here has quite a number of activities on Sundays in the fall. But what I suggest, I have a regular class on Saturday mornings. We're doing a collection of the Buddha's discourses called the Anguttara Nikaya. It's not systematic the way this class is, but I'd say that if you're free on Saturday mornings, then come for that class. Of course, I say the suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya are not so technical or so dense. They cover a wide variety of topics with often it passes from one topic to another, and very nice, very practical teachings dealing with many, many aspects of everyday life. So if you're free on Saturday mornings, come for that class. The last weekend, it's actually the Labor Day weekend, August 31st to September 3rd, I'm giving like a 3-day retreat here on a rather technical subject in Buddhist philosophy, which if you want to be daring, I'd say come for it. And you could register online. It's a bit technical, but just throw yourself into it. Don't be afraid or shy. In November, there will be a 10-day, but this is a bit difficult for somebody who doesn't have experience with shorter meditation retreats first. But there'll be a 10-day meditation retreat here, taught by a friend of mine, a Czech Buddhist monk. Yeah, but then in the spring, perhaps I'll have like a Sunday afternoon program on the Noble Eightfold Path, going through that book in detail, taking each chapter separately. So that will we get into a more finer, more detailed investigation of the path. But also what I suggest, and very important for continuing on the path, you've been learning basics of meditation practice here, so I would encourage everybody who really wants to develop to continue practicing on your own. Even if you're doing short periods each day, like if you can manage 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening, or even 20 minutes, do it. I don't think those short periods pose any risk of getting mentally overstressed, which happens if people do intensive meditation on their own. So I say that those are safe time periods, and gradually one will build up familiarity with the method of practice. And in the Saturday program, we have, before the actual class on the sutta, we have a 50-minute sitting, 5-0. But at first, of course, it could be a little difficult, but once you get used to it, it gets easier. Okay.
I have a question that came to mind when you were talking about mindful contemplation of feelings.
Yeah, I'm trying to see who is speaking. Oh, okay.
And the question is that I feel that generally there's a lot of focus given to the painful feelings that arise when you meditate, like a physical pain or maybe a sadness or something. And maybe I could get both of your opinions on this, because it's maybe a question that's suited for our meditation today. There was one time where I was sitting in a group meditation, and I had like a euphoric feeling.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it was so weird. It was like, I don't know, I couldn't find the source of it, and I just felt this like warm, fuzzy feeling like radiating from the inside.
Yeah.
And I started laughing, and I couldn't control it. It was like a quiet, like chuckling, and I couldn't control the laughter. And so I wanted to ask you, like, do you have an explanation of like, why did that? What is that? And then also, so like I have to say, like, it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so like now sometimes when I'm sick, I'm like, dude, maybe I can get back into that.
Yeah.
And then I'm kind of like bummed when it doesn't happen, you know? I'm like, oh, my back hurts, or like I'm crying about something.
Yeah, okay, why that happens, probably that is happening because the mind is settling down and getting sort of better concentrated. And so when that happens, it's sort of like a clearing is opening up. And that brings that feeling of joy, delight, gladness. That is quite a natural kind of event that happens during the process of meditation. So what we say is, when something like that happens, appreciate it, but don't become attached to it. And don't think, I have to hold on to this. I have to keep this. Because nothing is permanent. Well, one thing is permanent, but we're not there yet.
Taxes, right?
No. Taxes are recurrent, not really permanent. How to explain the laughter, that I don't know. Maybe it's just gladness because of that feeling, that euphoric feeling arising. But we say, when an extremely pleasant feeling arises, be mindful of it, recognize it, but don't hold on to it. Because whatever one holds on to is going to change, and when it changes, then comes disappointment. Okay, we'll take one more, then we'll have to break for the meditation session. Okay, please. Take.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit, or just provide a little bit more of information about the prescription against raising animals to be slaughtered. It's almost very radical.
Very
radical.
Radical.
I mean, I'm thinking of the United States, where we have farmers, and they're raising livestock to be slaughtered. And the prescription against it, or proscription, is very serious. So I was just wondering, it seems like, where did he get these feelings for animals? I mean, he's just...
Where did the Buddha get
The
that?
Buddha, yes.
Well, it's just his natural compassion, sort of great compassion, Okay, one, and then Annie, and then we'll
Thank
break.
you. On the point of mindful contemplation of the mind, the negative feelings that you mentioned, I did not hear you mention fear or pain. And in my own life, when I've had extreme pain or fear, I've tried to meditate. Is that prayer versus meditation? Is there a designation? Like, I was actively meditating to get out of the pain, and other times out of the fear. Is that relevant? You didn't mention those emotions.
There are many mental states that I couldn't mention. The way it's set out in the Buddha's sutta, or discourse on mindfulness, it focuses mainly on these three, because those are the three unwholesome roots. But there are many other kinds of unwholesome qualities. So whatever arises, one could turn into the object of observation. So if fear arises, one could simply focus in on the mind in a state of fear. And so then, instead of being sort of dominated by the fear and sort of driven by the fear, one could just sort of look into it And then often the fear will just dissolve and fall away. And similar with, well, the pain is the kind of feeling that comes under the category of feeling. But one could focus in more specifically on to get an inner sense of the texture of that pain and just observe the painful feeling, and it becomes very interesting. Even a state of fear can become very interesting when one just turns it into an observation, an object of observation. It's when we don't face it that it sort of controls us from the back. But when we look at it, it sort of falls away. Not immediately, but it sort of gradually it starts to fade away. Okay, Annie, then we'll end with you.
I was wondering,
Yeah, take.
as consumers, are we partaking in unwholesome livelihood when we buy meat to eat?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And in the Buddhist texts themselves, there's no requirement that people be vegetarian. Sort of the considered consensus that's emerged in the Buddhist tradition is that if one purchases meat that's already been on the market, then one is not responsible for the death of the animal, and so one is not at fault for the taking of life. I know there's a lot of debate goes on back and forth about this, and the Chinese Buddhist tradition, at least in the monasteries, are strictly vegetarian. In the countries of Southern Asia, like Thailand, Burma, even Sri Lanka, they're not strictly vegetarian. Even the monasteries are not vegetarian.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we'll stop now, maybe take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to the other side of the room for the meditation.